analysis of management culture, which is about a multinational meeting. And the Germans and Scandinavians sit looking very crossly when the meeting is 15 minutes started. And they say, when are we going to begin this meeting properly? And the Mexicans and Brazilians say, we've been having this meeting for the last 15 minutes. What's your problem? So I think we've already had a very good start to the meeting, judging by the conversations around the room that I've just been listening to. If people are sitting at the back, I'm going to invite you, please, to come and sit in the front row. Thank you. Madeline, you are our shining light in showing how to do participation. We are a total of about 15 people. So if you actually just want to sit at the back and do email, Vince is not quite sure whether he wants to sit at the back and do email or come forwards, but please do, I do encourage you to come forward a little bit so that you can be part of the discussion. And there's various people in the room that I'm going to call upon to be part of the discussion a bit later on, Desiree and Malcolm and Alejandro. So we're going to have as interactive a discussion as possible. Before we do that, we're going to begin, I think, with a little bit of kind of fact-checking in terms of the process of what's going to happen going forwards. We'll actually begin with some fact-checking, which is that I'll say who I am. I'm Chris Marsden of the University of Sussex. I'm moderating the discussion. I'm not a subject matter expert. My expertise is probably much more about policy towards net neutrality, but we don't discuss that at the UK IGF, at least not until the next meeting, apparently. And on the panel, we have Jean-Jacques Sahel from ICANN, we have Alex Bloers from Nominet, we have Dominique Lazansky from GSMA. They're going to introduce, well, they can introduce themselves a bit more, but I think in this crowd we probably don't need to do too much of that. You know all these people for years, and they've done lots and lots of interesting things and have a great deal of expertise, and I think that's a generic explanation which works. So first of all, Jean-Jacques is going to speak from the ICANN perspective on what the process described by the US government is going forward, with some of the bells and whistles that ICANN is attaching to it. And there is actually a presentation. We thought it might be useful just to get some factual stuff up there to start with. Jean-Jacques.
Okay, so good morning, everyone. It's nice to see you again, because there's about 90% of us who were at the ICANN London meeting, so you've heard a lot about this already. So this is indeed more an opportunity for dialogue, I think, than giving you updates. So again, many of you will have seen the latest on the transition and the accountability processes. So these are just slides on accountability, and I will be able to circulate some, just a couple more slides on the transition process itself separately after the meeting. So just to put this in context, on the 14th of March, the US government announced that it was intending to transition its stewardship of the IANA contract by the end of its current contract with ICANN for the management of these functions, and that ends in September 2015. As a result of that announcement, two processes started. The first one is specifically about this transition of their oversight or stewardship of the IANA functions. Sorry, thank you. It started with an initial consultation. Okay. Thank you. This is the famous Barry White impression. So we had an initial consultation, broadly speaking, in April on that process. Basically, what's going to happen now, which was announced early June, is that a coordination working group will be formed. It has evolved a little bit from the initial thoughts that were proposed in drafts in April. Now it will be composed of 27 members, basically drawn from the various stakeholder groups. So, 2 or 3 representatives nominated by the stakeholder groups. The selectees, I think is the word, will be announced tomorrow, 2nd of July, and then the group will go on continuing to exchange with the community and building up to a more defined blueprint for what this oversight or stewardship function will look like or could look like going forwards. The idea being, of course, to build a rough consensus among members of the community so that by spring, summer next year, the blueprint can be broadly adopted by this rough consensus and shared with the US government, and hopefully be in a position for this transition to move forward around the time of the contract renewal in September 2015. Now, the other process that was started soon after The first one is a process to basically look at ICANN's capabilities, if you will, thinking that we are transitioning after 15 years to a model where we will not have a governmental oversight, if all goes well, by September 2015. So does the organization ICANN and the setup generally, is it basically fit for purpose going forwards in this new structure, if you will, or this new organization? And so that ranges from various checks and balances and other accountability mechanisms to just our general plans. So for that sort of capability part or accountability review, that's where I've got slides. Some of you have seen those, so I will go quickly. So again, it's, the idea is to form an accountability working group. This accountability working group will be again formed by mainly community members, but also some subject matter experts and potentially one board liaison person. And then again, the working group will coordinate community dialogue and as needed, will create sub-working groups on specific subject areas, final report to the board, but also generally for that rough consensus approval in broadly the same time frame. I think that was up for debate last week as to how these two processes should progress, how much in parallel they should be. I think the mood generally was that we should try and make them progress at the same time, but we have to allow for some flexibility because one might be finished earlier than the other, etc. So what we would hope is the accountability working group would be formed, confirmed in coming days, and for it to start imminently. So that's on the factual piece, and I'll stop here for now. Thank you.
We're being filmed, so I was moving away from the camera, but I'm now back in front of it. So I wanted to give you, everyone in this room, I imagine. Actually, let me just check the temperature of the room. Does everyone in this room, or is there anyone in this room who doesn't know who Milton Mueller is? Right. So okay, the guy doing the sound at the back doesn't, but that's fine. So Milton has, as you know, opined about the IANA transition, and I just want to read out a couple of things that Milton mentioned as a basis for starting the policy discussion. People who don't know, Milton, of course, wrote I think the authoritative tome on the history of the creation of ICANN, Ruling the Root, which is now, I think, 12 years old, the book. It's an extraordinarily ancient book in terms of internet governance, at least. And he talked about two things. He said, first of all, at a meeting with a non-commercial users constituency in London, this is at ICANN last week, NTIA Director Lawrence Strickling confirmed our sense that structural separation of IANA from ICANN is not out of scope. The IANA transition and accountability are separate, and they have no problem with an IANA transition plan that that tries to align DNS governance with the governance of protocol parameters and numbers. So in other words, the idea that ICANN and IANA are inextricably linked is not something which is set in stone as far as this review is concerned, which I think is an interesting point that people might want to address. The second thing he talks about, and we've already heard Jean-Jacques mention that tomorrow we have, it feels a little bit like the kind of World Cup draw or something, doesn't it? Tomorrow we find out exactly who the 27 members will be. We might press Jean-Jacques on if that's the number. And he talks about the role of the coordinating committee for the IANA transition is no longer viewed as a steering committee that makes the plan for the IANA transition. So it may make proposals, but it won't be, as it were, providing the blueprint on its own. But one of the things he says is that the Government Advisory Committee, true to its status as the voice of dinosaurs in the internet ecosystem, wants to be given 5 seats on the Coordinating Committee. Apparently it is viewing the Coordinating Committee as a voting body and believes that governments cannot be represented by other governments, hence the 5, which of course Security Council membership is almost exactly the same number. But the view of the GAC it should not be to vote or to represent all diverse views, but to serve as a liaison to government. So there's a fundamental problem here, which I think is a problem that's carried on throughout ICANN's history, which is the GAC appears to believe that there is this voting structure or veto structure that it can exercise. And if that also exists on this CC, I think we're in a very unusual position. And he also mentions one final thing, which is that it's not at all clear yet, and there was an interesting exchange he had with the chairman of ICANN, it's not at all clear yet what happens if the blueprint produced by the proposals produced by the CC, when they finally emerge, if there is substantial community disagreement about these, what does the ICANN board do about them, and what really is the role of the ICANN board? Is it supposed to be approving such things? Because that isn't certainly Strickling's view in terms of community-based governance. So I think we've got some really interesting issues there. I will raise just one other issue, which is that you're probably aware that the French government issued a communiqué at the end of the ICANN 50 meeting, which was, people might want to comment on it, but they suggested that ICANN was not the venue for sensible discussions of internet governance going forward. So that's just some things to start off with. I'd welcome Alex and Dominic responding to those things, but I know Alex wanted to say something about the CCNSO role in this thing as well. So, Alex?
Yeah, so there's actually lots in what you've, there's lots I'd like to comment on in what you've just talked about there, Chris. But just in order to kind of keep the debate focused, I think, on what seems to me to be the core of the issue and where we are at the end of a week of ICANN compared with where we were at the beginning of a week of ICANN. I think it's very clear that there are essentially three debates all running simultaneously. One of them is actually a very practical debate about what do we do to substitute for the role that the US Department of Commerce currently plays to ensure that the technical and operational management of the route by IANA continues to be done in a way which is efficient, timely, and abides by agreed quality of service standards. So that's kind of a highly technical question. Well, it's not a highly technical question, but it's essentially a slightly boring question compared with some of the other ones that people would like to discuss. From a CCTLD perspective, from a customer perspective, that's actually the most important question. What do we do to ensure that the internet continues to run smoothly, that the route zone management function is performed to a high standard, and that the IANA team can be held to account in a new process where there is no contractual relationship with the US government. So that's kind of point one. And I think that's you know, a pretty important debate that almost to some degree got lost last week in some perhaps more exciting and provocative debates about some other issues. The second strand of this is about the linked question of ICANN itself's ultimate accountability. Who is it ultimately accountable to? So if we think about the functions that the Department of Commerce has played under the existing arrangements, in addition to maintaining that contract with IANA, it has also periodically intervened to ensure that ICANN has stayed, if you like, on the tram lines, functioning well both as a policy-making body and as this kind of point body for these technical functions. And I think that there are some big questions there about what do you do, for instance, to replicate the kinds of processes that we have in place at the moment, like the affirmation of commitments process, the periodic ATRT reviews, which are very much the mechanism by which we see the continued quality assurance of ICANN being maintained. And I think there's a real issue here because implicit in this discussion is that nobody wants to see an intergovernmental or a multilateral type model for supervision of ICANN. Actually, that's not implicit, that's an explicit statement of the US government that that's not an acceptable outcome. Okay, well, if that's off the table, that probably also means, or it might mean, that a treaty-based solution, some form of oversight or supervision of ICANN underpinned in a treaty change in international law is also quite likely to be either off the table or at least a very, very high-risk solution because of the danger that a treaty-based solution becomes contaminated, if I can use that rather loaded term, by these notions of governmental supervision. So what is that accountability mechanism going to look like? Because it is not acceptable, however high our regard for the existing management team or the board of ICANN, it is not acceptable structurally for ICANN to mark its own homework. So I think that's the second important question that we have to address. Now, the third thing, which was actually what a lot of people wanted to discuss last week at ICANN, was all of the as it were, ongoing gripes and grumbles within the ICANN community about how ICANN makes policy, how it balances the views of different stakeholders. Does the GNSO function, the principal policy-making group in ICANN, is that working well? What about the role of the GAC? Do they need to be put back in their box? Or if you're a GAC member, do they need to be taken more seriously when they have, you know, such very strong and pungently expressed views on critical issues like the use of geographic indicators for wine, etc.? Those are issues which, in all the time I've been involved in ICANN, have been running and running and running. And what concerns me slightly is the question of the conditionality around the transition of fixing all of those outstanding issues, all of those historic issues that people have. Because I think there are two things that we have to fix. We have to work out what the IANA transition looks like and what the substitute mechanism for the contract is. And we have to fix the big ticket question, the marking your own homework question. I don't think it's realistic to think that in a year we can fix all of the gripes and grumbles that have been rumbling on, frankly, as long as I've been aware of ICANN. We're not going to do that within a year. Just one final point on the timing. There's been a bit of a discussion about how real the deadline that the US government has set actually is. So the US government has said they want a community-based solution to be delivered, wrapped in a parcel with a neat bow, by September 2015. That's really, really challenging time scale, almost regardless of the scope of the size and scope of the exercise, in my view. Larry Strickling said last week, actually, he was pretty relaxed about that. There could be some slippage, but I don't think there can be that much slippage for the straightforward reason that we're already getting to the point where we're nearly at we're nearly into electioneering season, and this is a highly contentious issue politically in the United States, and I think it is very unlikely that if we don't deliver something by the end of 2015, that there will be a solution this side of the presidential election. So I do believe that the clock is ticking in this process, and progress will have to be made actually pretty fast. Thank you.
It's interesting. Obama, of course, couldn't secure net neutrality within the lifetime of two presidencies. It would be heroic to think they could actually achieve something with the IANA function within that time scale as well. Dominique.
I agree with you on that as well. I think that both sides of the political parties, Democrats and Republicans, will both use it to their advantage in the elections. But we can discuss that further. So I'm supposed to represent business in this discussion, which I think is kind of interesting because business has a wide variety of views depending on vested interests and location and culture. So, for example, you know, VeriSign has a particular role it currently plays, and as a rather large corporate organization, and China Unicom might have a different approach to what they think IANA transition should mean and what the outcome should mean. But I just want to talk maybe a little bit about sort of our experiences at GSMA around the thinking around the IANA transition, because we see over 1,000 different mobile ecosystem players. So 800 mobile operators are our members, and about 250 ecosystem entities like Facebook or Ericsson or whatever it might be. And we've been discussing internally with our members, you know, what is our approach to this? What do we think about it? And all of those kinds of things. And there are clear differences depending on region. In the US, it was definitely, you know, we would like the status quo, and that was the original thinking. That's evolved quite a lot, whereas Europe is like, oh, maybe, you know, some players in Europe were interested in considering, you know, a more intergovernmental model. And so it's been a fascinating journey to kind of see how we can, you know, evolve our thinking as all of these processes are taking place, and especially after ICANN last week as well. I think there's a couple things that a lot of industry that I talk to, even industry, not Western industry, and mobile operators agree on, and that's the fact of the matter is the end result of this whole process should ensure the security, stability, resiliency, and openness of the internet. So much like we have today, we don't really want to upset that in any way, and especially from a business perspective, that underlines and underpins everything that any organization, whether it's a mobile industry or Google or a startup, or it doesn't really matter. It underpins everything and all the work that they actually do and actually want to do. Just on ICANN accountability, after ICANN last week, there's been more sort of discussions about it just among different business groups, and I think the agreement and the clarity on separating ICANN accountability in that process from IANA seems to be more in the forefront of all industry. And I'm generalizing this quite a lot, but I really think that now some of the business participants who either are part of the commercial stakeholder group or attended ICANN for the first time last week really said, okay, we really need to think about these as separate entities, but as part of the process going forward in parallel. And I think that's going to be continued to be discussed even more. I think it really hit home last week. So those are some thoughts. I think we can discuss many other things. And I know that there are probably people like Malcolm in the room who have a lot more to say about sort of an ISP perspective.
So this is how we'll structure things. Is this on? Jean-Jacques, I'll give you a chance to respond to what's been said so far. You don't have to mention the French government's perspective necessarily, but it would be quite interesting. As one of the few people who actually properly understands and translates the actual language used, I don't just mean technical translation, I mean translating the language of a government communicator to other things. But I also wanted to bring in three other people who are sort of proto-panelists here. Malcolm Hutty from Lynx, Des as well, and also Alejandro, who's worked a lot on the reviews of some of the technical functions of ICANN, so that will help us to get the ball rolling. What we might do then, Laura, is I'll leave one microphone on this side of the front of the room, and if you put one there, sort of amongst, with Alejandro, and then it can sort of be passed around, because we're a small enough group that we want to record for remote listening, but I think we can allow people to self-govern the microphones a bit. So I'll pass this to Malcolm, and Jean-Jacques, if you want to mention anything, feel free to ignore the comments I've made.
Thank you, Chris. I wanted to, first I'd like to say that I agree with really just about everything that's been said on the panel. I may be slightly more relaxed about delay past September 2015 than some are, personally, but apart from that, I agree with everything. So I would really like to amplify on, particularly on what Alex was referring to about the accountability issues that must and those that cannot be a prerequisite to NTIA transition. And it is, I think, NTIA transition. It's not IANA transition. It's a transition of the NTIA's role in this and the NTIA stewardship role. And the NTIA has set out 4 bullet points that need to be addressed. Dominique sort of summarised those very briefly, or at least key elements of those. And I think the question there is how do we ensure that those endure? It's not sufficient to see that they're addressed at the moment of transition, but how do we ensure that they can endure into the future? Fadi Chahadi, he's a very capable guy that can achieve big things. And if there's one, and he is achieving big things at the moment, and he's doing a lot. And if there's one thing that possibly summarises his mission as that he's embarked on at the moment, is globalisation. That's his thing. What about the next guy? When the next guy comes in, if he is as capable and as ambitious and as driving as Fadi is, he's going to want a big thing too. What is that big thing going to be? Yeah. Well, we don't know. We can't guess that sort of thing. These things will evolve over time. But we do want to ensure that whatever it is something that we can feel comfortable with. Yeah, that is not fundamentally in conflict with why we think that ICANN is a good organisation to be the steward of the DNS. In short, we want to see that, that he doesn't come in and say those 4 principles that we had before, they were good for their time, but we're moving on now, and we've got a completely different vision of what ICANN can contribute to the development of the internet. And how would, so the question I think that needs to be addressed before the NTIA relinquishes this role is how do we ensure that ICANN has enough space to be able to evolve within the bounds of what it should be doing, addressing new circumstances as they arise, and indeed improving, its own internal accountability, for example, and other things, while at the same time remaining true to that which we really think ought to endure, and that if it fundamentally changed, we would think, hold on, how do we get ourselves into this position, and more particularly, what are we going to do to get out of it? And so something there, and I feel concerned that if we leave adherence to those basic principles as being something that's wholly within the control of the ICANN board, or institutions that are ultimately answerable to the ICANN board, and whose decisions and recommendations and so forth must be ultimately decided, this is what the community has said, by the ICANN board, then we don't have really an enduring mechanism to ensure that we remain true to those principles. Now, I don't know what the mechanism for doing that is, but I think the United States has done a very good job on starting a very good starting point for what we think is more fundamental, as opposed to things like accountability for appeals on particular decisions and all that sort of stuff, which will need to evolve over time, but can do so within the ICANN processes, within the ICANN community, through the PDP and so forth. And that's the sort of distinction that I would draw there. I thought last week was very successful, actually, in terms of in one respect, and that's that we went into it, I felt, where ICANN was trying to split accountability into one corner, and IANA transition very narrowly defined into another corner. There the twain should meet. The IANA transition needs to be decided on a strict time frame and should not wait on accountability, and accountability is done through processes entirely answerable to the board. That's how I felt going into it. And I came out of it in a much more comfortable place, thinking that there was more of a consensus in the community that, yes, some accountability issues really can't be a prerequisite for this. It will stop this process going, and it's not appropriate. Ultimately, these are things that are a continual process that needs to be built on essentially forevermore to forever improve the organisation. But other things aren't. And there are some core principles that need to be established, and that a mechanism for defending them needs to be established and identified before we can feel comfortable about the US no longer acting as the ultimate guarantor of those principles. And I thought there was a considerable degree of consensus on that within the room, I felt. I thought that Milton, for once, acted as a consensus-building agent in that, which is a...
Let's repeat that. Milton acted as a consensus-building agent.
Well, which is, or as Chris Despain put it, I agree with Milton. Yeah. I don't think there's anything more to say on that, really.
John, if you want to come back.
You go. I just wanted to ask a follow-up question, actually, on that, and this is a question to everybody in the room. I made a kind of statement, but actually I think it's a statement that should be in inverted commas, which is that because one of the ways that we would address exactly that issue conventionally is that we would build those principles into an international treaty which countries would then sign up to. I think there is a strong desire to avoid a treaty-based solution here, but I wonder whether that reflects a general consensus or actually is just a reflection of a more narrow class of stakeholder view.
The problem with it, if you initiate a treaty-making process, you lose control of what it does. If it were just to establish and enshrine principles, you might have more people that were open to it. But once you initiate that process, you've got the risk that it doesn't become just establishing principles, but it establishes something else instead.
Yeah.
Maybe the ITU plenipot could grab
There's the other workshops.
Yeah.
Exactly.
If I may just make one other thing, I think it's useful that people should appreciate the risk factor here, what we're talking about, that if this goes wrong in the future. There are two areas where ICANN has really used its particular position of power over GTLDs to extend its authority into adjacent areas. Very much at the request of the community and supported by many, but nonetheless, they are not purely DNS maintenance issues, and they are the UDRP which is essentially about ensuring that there is not abuse of trademarks and that there is recourse against abuse of trademarks. And the who is, and particularly the future who is thing for the experts working group final report, which essentially is about ensuring that domain registrants are available to be traced by those that need to be traced to trace them. These are not about running the routes. They are adjacent issues that can be addressed by ICANN through by applying principles that end-user registrants must abide by, and it is used as the mechanism of the registry agreement and the registrar accreditation agreement to enforce ICANN-developed policies on end users. So they're significant. Now, I'm not going to go into the issues of those particular policies, but the question that I'm really raising is, what happens if there's another area that is introduced in the future that is not about but that nonetheless that end users must be subject to ICANN-developed policies that approximate or harmonise international norms, but is done through a ICANN process for dispute resolution, such as UDRP. Now, how would we feel comfortable about that if it were about, public order, or if it were generally about the use of domains for unlawful purposes, as determined by a UDRP-style panel? That's the sort of thing that we have potentially at risk if we don't have a mechanism for saying that ICANN is acting ultra vires, which is basically what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
And that's, I should say, that's where the who is controversy, the order is really going to hit the fan on this one at a very appropriate moment. Just as we're trying to work out the IANA transition process, we discover the real huge problem with what the Chinese would not call a content-based issue within ICANN. So I think it's actually very instructive that's happening at the same time. Jean-Jacques, you wanted to mention something?
Well, it goes back to one of the earlier points I think you made, Chris, which is ICANN's place in the internet governance ecosystem, in a sense that, ICANN is just one part of the ecosystem. There are a number of setups that deal with other issues, IETF for standards, etc., etc. And there are areas where there are gaps, or there may be gaps. And that needs to be filled, but that needn't be, and there probably shouldn't be for ICANN to do. There should be something else. And so if you look at the Net Mundial outcomes, for instance, there's a roadmap, a fairly high-level roadmap. There's only a small part of that roadmap which concerns ICANN and IANA. The rest has to be handled somehow. So, and it's not so clear now as to who is going to be leading that. So there's talks of a new alliance that's been mentioned last week, maybe some sort of platform that brings people together and enables sort of issue-specific tracks to deal with precisely those sorts of other areas. So we'll see how that shapes up, and I think we all need to work on that as members of the internet governance ecosystem, because I think it needs to happen. Because indeed the risk, the alternative is either there's some sort of indirect mission or direct mission creep that's imposed on ICANN by the community because, well, someone started an issue and we just end up having to deal with it because it's vaguely related to domain names, or goes back to revert to an intergovernmental type setup which will just mire us in interminable discussions and et cetera, et cetera. So that's where it goes back to your point about missions and having a sort of future-ready type organization. It needs to be sustainable. It would be great if we had a setup that was fit for the next 10, 15 years at least. I mean, technology advances, blah, 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 but, not something that we're going to have to rewrite in 2 or 3 years' time. So having the right mission and underlying values is great. I think the values are pretty good. I mean, it was interesting at the opening ceremony of ICANN that many of you were at to compare the values of ICANN in 1999 or 1998, and the values of now, they're the same. Right? Might need to be applied in different ways, etc., but the values are there. When we look at oversight, we need to think about what is the public interest objectives, if you will, that are assigned to ICANN. I've been in other setups, when I was in government, for instance, dealing with some tiny intergovernmental organizations, for instance, in the satellite world, and it's not the best example in many ways, but it's just to illustrate these organizations created initially by governments slowly become privatized. They still have some small public interest mission that they're accountable to, in this particular case, governments too. There's just 3 or 4 missions, depending on which organization we talk to. So what is this mission? There's a bit in the US announcement that talks about it. Broadly speaking, it's very much about the stable and resilient domain name system that supports the internet, where there's probably 2 or 3 others. And I think, for us as ICANN staff, it would be really useful to make that, to confirm that in terms of the next oversight. And I think it's important for the community that we have that. Just quickly finish on time frame. It is a challenging time frame, and Alex and others have mentioned some of the reasons why it's important that we move forward. I think even just generally, we cannot lose impetus. It would be such a shame. We've got a window of opportunity where a lot of people, that many of whom have fought each other for a while, seem to be converging, or at least trying to make proposals in a very constructive manner. We've got the chance of coming up with a rough consensus for the next structure of the domain name governance, and that's pretty exciting. We should try and we should be able to do it within a year's time frame. It's going to be demanding. Now, it's a bit too early to say, well, the blueprint will look like that, but it's going to come in the next few weeks. And if you think about the time frame, we really have to propose something to the wider community and show it to the US administration by about sort of spring-ish next year, if we're to have something broadly approved and rolling by September. So really, we're going to have a lot of work between now and the very beginning of next year. So it's not that you need to have a blueprint ready in the next 2 weeks, but input will be ready. So the 2 groups are going to meet for the first time this month and have methods of working agreed and specific missions and objectives and how they're going to vet things past the community. Then it's going to be hard work. So I hope you can all input there. Thank you. Sorry,
It indicates the importance of both Marrakesh and possibly even next year's IGF as the sort of face-saving, community-based, consensus-built process after the entire process is finished. I'll use the microphone for a second because I'm clearly not carrying properly. Alex, did you want to mention something? I was going to pass on to Desiree to bring up a couple of issues as well.
Yeah, I just very, very briefly, and picking up on something that Jean-Jacques has said there, I think there are definitely signs that there's a kind of a very coherent narrative emerging around what needs to happen and what are the key criteria. But there are some significant outliers in that we will have to think about. One of those, for instance, is the extent to which, and I think, again, this is something I'll just put out there because I'll be interested in views. One comment that was made last week was that this is a great opportunity to build into the values and the mission of ICANN a strong and proactive commitment towards human rights as a kind of foundational principle of the way that ICANN should operate. Now, I make no comments on the broader debate around human rights and the internet, other than to say that strikes me as potentially a very, very tricky issue to seek to navigate one's way around as we try and hit this challenging timetable. But at the same time, it's clear that some parts of the community will feel very strongly that is something that this is an opportunity to hardwire into the system in a way that perhaps it hasn't been up to now.
I must say, I think trademark holders do feel that their property rights are not being fully protected within ICANN, so I can understand why they would feel that human rights are being violated under the current process. You may have been thinking of other human rights as well, but obviously
yes, the right to enjoy one's property is clearly a very important human right, yeah.
The European Court of Justice constantly reminds us in some of these filtering cases. Dominique, did you want to mention something? I was going to move on to Desiree in a moment.
Yeah, no, let's move on to that as well.
So I innocently stated that I thought that maybe ICANN didn't seem to be a very technical group, and I was corrected. So I wanted to take the correction on board, but also anything else that Desiree wanted to mention just at this stage.
Well, that was part of a morning conversation. I think maybe I could just tell you that a member of a technical community of ICANN had put already a useful postage. If you go to IANAtransition.org, it reminds us that we have exactly 456 days and 16 hours before the 30th of September next year to come up with really viable solutions on how to transition the USG stewardship role. also Malcolm, who said it's not about IANA transition, it's about IANA is functioning really well. And the reason why it's functioning really well, because there are parts of technical community that actively participate in the work of ICANN. And although it may not be so visible when you come to an ICANN meeting, there are meetings in parallel taking place by the address supporting organization in charge of IP address allocation, the regional interest registries. There is the root server, the RSAC and SSAC, that are looking at the security and stability of the root zone, and also coming up with policies on security and stability of the whole DNS system, which I think would be necessary part. I'm looking forward to their review in terms of what that transition means. But also we have representatives of the IETF, which serve, and W3C, and the ITU that serve as liaison on the ICANN board. So there is a lot of technical input that goes into decision-making processes on the ICANN board itself. And also we should not forget that supporting organizations such as CCNSO and GNSO could actually start this process by developing their own terms of accountability and transparency now, or what they need. There is this coordination group that is going to be announced tomorrow that consists of 27 members, from CCNSO, 2 from GAC, which is debatable, and few from the
How many from CCNSO?
4.
4.
As you know, CCTLDs are a customer of IANA, like the IETF and RRIs and GTLDs and some infrastructure TLDs. So I think the process needs to start early, and these supporting organizations could themselves start looking into what necessary accountable mechanism they'd like to see in place. And I agree also that we won't be able to solve all the issues of ICANN accountability, but at least what we can do is focus on IANA transition to the global multi-stakeholder community, which is not another intergovernmental organization, as it was one of the requests in the NTIA's announcement. And when we look around and when we see where is that global internet community, well, we seem all to point to one big fora. It's either ICANN or IGF or a combination of two, and which one is more functioning. But we should also not forget that at the time where the ICANN has been set up, there's always this almost immediate buy-in that one day ICANN would run the A root server, which is currently operated and run by VeriSign. Those were the initial things that the global internet community thought would happen, and it would have happened much sooner than 2014. And why didn't we start making these accountability processes and documents in place? There certainly a lot of efforts in terms of how to manage some of the COs in aspect of IANA. But I see a lot of creativity, I think, to leave it on a positive note. I see a lot of creativity in terms of building this additional mechanism between different SOs among ICANN, not just throughout the coordination group, but between CCs and GAC and a lot of working groups. I've been involved in the work of something called the Framework of Interpretation Working Group, which has to deal with CCTLD's delegation and redelegation, and so has, I think, Martin, if he's here. And that is one of the important elements of IANA's function. I think CCTLDs have a lot to say in this process and are equally important like all the others.
It's always good to get the view from the entire iceberg rather than the bit that I see, which is just on top. So thank you for that. There is an interesting point, which is that presumably when NSI sold out to VeriSign, VeriSign did realize they were going to get another 15 years of this stuff before it even came to a question to challenge their commercial interest in this way. I wanted to pass the microphone to Alejandro, and that's because he's been involved in a couple of reviews of ICANN from the technical perspective, and this R word, the resilience word. So Alejandro, if you could just let us know what's going on, and also if you want to respond to anything that's been said, feel free.
Thank you. I'll be machine gun-like, I hope. Some of the things that have been mentioned really are also worth a footnote, at least. I think no one should shy away from recognizing the total originality of the new entity that has to be created. Non-governmental, with global authority, recognized by governments. That's going to be very challenging, and people should look in depth instead of looking only at the window furnishings. There's really some political science and international relations theory that has to come in at a very high level, and the more the better, the higher the better. About the France issue, to illustrate this level of complexity, let me put forward a very cynical, very cold-headed reassessment. Let's say ICANN was based in Europe, and it had approved .cars, domain name. And the US came into the meeting banging their fist on the table saying, you know, .cars, we didn't even invent the car, they build cars and they sell cars everywhere. But you know, we have a couple of geographical denominations that are very important for us under the cars name, like Detroit, Dearborn, Pontiac. These are really cultural landmarks in the buildup of the American nation. And we won't have any of this. So the world would react. You know, all NGOs and most governments would say, you know, this is intolerable. This is the US capitalist imperialist tradition of using governments' international language to protect their own economic their own private sector's economic interest. So maybe one could look at this whole thing as, you know, France upping the ante in what's going. They know in advance is going to end up in a negotiation, and one could then follow this discourse with more angles of view, at least. IANA works well. As you mentioned, Chris, I was involved in a couple of reviews that looked at the technical work of ICANN. One of them is a very large and public one, which is the stability, the review of how ICANN was fulfilling a couple of years ago its commitments under the affirmation of commitments with the US for stability, security, and resilience of the DNS. The review showed ICANN working well with points to improve. These improvements have been on march for this last couple of years. And the ATRT, which in ICANN parlance means the Accountability and Transparency Review Team number 2, has looked at how ICANN has been complying with the recommendations of the report, and they come with flying colors. So it's a part that's working well. And I looked at it at a more technical and operational view with a small team of people, some of them very high-level IT consultants, as a IT best practices review of ICANN, and there we found that IANA is a team that leads technical competence in ICANN, technical management competence as well. They have the absolute best part of what IT can do in ICANN. So the operation is good. They are very sound on that they shouldn't be making policy themselves. And one must remember, when in the ICANN world one says policy, it doesn't mean government policy. It's not a proxy for politics. That's the meaning of policy in Wiz's words. It actually means remove the potential for arbitrary or discretionary decisions made at the IANA level. It means remove the possibility that someone will change something in the DNS without proper process. So that's policy, and they are very aware of that. So that's not a problem. For accountability, again, understanding ICANN better, all these accountability and transparency review team works have actually enhanced enormously the bureaucracy that's required by the community for ICANN to perform, and actually made it harder for those really interested to see what accountability and transparency are at the core process level. So one should look at this, as I usually say, from a Copernican point of view and not anymore from the Ptolemaic epicycle upon epicycle way it's growing. Now is the time to look, what are the core requirements of accountability and how do you fulfill them, instead of just putting in even more process which will obscure things and make it easier to capture, or to always have someone using a flaming sword, flaming finger to signal what's wrong. One thing that leads to things like the DSSA weirdness, which you have already pointed to, Chris, so I won't belabor the point. I would call on everybody interested to read the final report of the ICANN panel on it's called ICANN and the Internet Governance Ecosystem. I was a member of that team. The chair was Vint Cerf. That was published early this year. It comes up with a few principles that I think are very useful for this process. Accountability and transparency, motherhood, apple pie, world peace. Yeah, but because who can say no to that? But effectiveness of the organization, as Alex, my tocayo, my namesake, has said, first concern is that it works. People forget this whole at-large construct. Everything else are interested in participation, transparency, and accountability, and openness, and inclusiveness, and so forth. But for what? I mean, the thing has to work. The thing has actually to resolve names, has to make changes in a way that you can trust. You cannot. It has to be impossible to steal the CCTLD stewardship for .uk from Nominet unless they're really misperforming and a lot of parties wish it, and then it's not a steal. That's the kind of things that you want from ICANN. So effectiveness is there. Reciprocity. I mean, if you shape policy, you have to live with the policy. This was already there in 2003 when we restructured ICANN. It was, entities cannot hold ICANN policy development forever just because they can. If they don't live, if they don't have a commitment to live with it. So this is the kind of principles that are at work there: robustness, resilience, and above everything else, a sense of stewardship, a sense of I may be, I'm a CCTLD and I may have to sacrifice some of my wishes of controlling the entity for the general good. Same for RIRs and everybody else. And finally, on the human rights issue, I have a slightly controversial view here, which is that, again, motherhood, apple pie, human rights, who can say no? But how effective can they be? How deep can you take them as design principles for a technical coordination entity? And as a prime example, I would use always, every declaration I've seen on internet rights and principles comes up with right to life as one of the first ones, one of the first principles. Insert that into internet governance principles. Try to apply them in internet governance. Do you really all want to deal with Texas anti-abortionists for the design of the domain name system or the allocation of IP addresses? I would be very careful in just how much you wish of that before you see it fulfilled.
Point very well taken, and actually all the points that were made about the technical architecture and the resilience of the underlying functions that IANA performs, I think, is very important to bear in mind. I should say that one thing that we do need to be aware of is that of the original, I think there was some research that was done by Sandra Brahman that showed that the original first 1,000 RFCs by the IETF, 18% had discussions either within the RFC or within the mailing list on the RFC explicitly about privacy. So there are certainly human rights which are very deeply embedded in the internet architecture, and it's certainly the case that we should neither elevate human rights to some kind of tablet without which we cannot do anything, but also we mustn't ignore the fact that privacy and freedom of expression are important. And that doesn't mean making comments, as I heard in the earlier session, of someone said, oh, well, I'm in favor of the open internet, which is, of course, nonsense, ludicrous comment that doesn't take us anywhere on any kind of discussion at all. But I'm sure the panel want to come back on those things. And then we should have open season on the floor where people can wave at Laura and grab hold of the microphone and make impassioned claims that we should not separate these functions or otherwise. So.
As a bit of a slight outsider, I would say, in all of this, only because I'm following internet governance, and this is one of the key sort of things to follow. It strikes me when discussing the technical aspect and the whole process, there's different strands, right? There's the political response to all of this that tends to be quite emotive depending on where you come from. But then obviously there's also the technical aspect and maintaining the security and things that I mentioned. And one thing that always comes up to me, and some of the other private sector members mentions it too, is the status quo from a political perspective isn't working in a sense and needs to be transitioned. From a technical perspective, it works really well, right? Mm-hmm. I could be completely wrong, but as far as I understand, it works extremely well. So there's a lot of, so my observation, I guess, is that there's a lot of politicalness involved in all of this, and it always strikes me every time we talk about it.
Yeah.
I'm not sure this is the right moment to make this point. It's not a major...
That means it definitely is.
It's just been interesting in the last few days to think about the parallels between some of the discussions around internet governance at the moment and the entire filmography of Monty Python.
From the flying circus.
Well, someone mentioned to me, on last Monday, this just reminds me of Holy Grail. So watch the movie and you'll see exactly what issue they were referring to. But I mean, just generally, we were talking about, Brazil, which was a Terry Gilliam movie, and Robert De Niro being, suffocated by paper and bureaucracy. We had the Ministry of City Walks. There's a lot of absurdity being discussed, and it just feels like we're in this fight where we're trying to move on to a 21st century that's a bit freer from unnecessary bureaucracy. That's it. I'll stop here.
It is worth bearing in mind, Alejandro was talking about the need for ICANN to increase its bureaucracy in response to all these calls for transparency and accountability and so on. And I'm always comforted, I don't know whether Mark necessarily feels the same, but I'm always comforted that whenever I look at internet governance as an issue, I do find myself, particularly when it comes to ICANN and Nominet, face-to-face with the DTI team who are the experts in these things from a long way back. So it's always comforting to know that we're in good hands with these things. Comments from the floor, not necessarily from Mark in response to that, but from others as well. Madeline, have you got access to a microphone? This is Madeline Carr.
I wasn't referring to Mark at all.
No, I'm making this here.
Thank you. I just wanted to put in a word for politics, I guess. I was really taken by Alessandro's comment about looking at these problems through an international relations perspective, because that's what I do. And I think what ICANN in particular is facing is a problem that we've seen in, in other global governance spheres, like environmental global governance, which is this problem of, a post-state issue that doesn't really fit within a multilateral governance framework anymore. And so, we end up with this multi-stakeholder model that kind of works in some ways and doesn't work in other ways. But if we look at other areas of global governance, one of the key issues for sustainable global governance systems traditionally has been that more or less those with power, which we might look to states in this context, feel that their interests are being more or less promoted. Not in every way and not 1,000% in every situation, but if they don't feel that their interests are being addressed, then that's typically has not been a sustainable global governance model. And I think in a lot of these debates about ICANN, there's an assumption that if we give governments a voice, then the whole thing is just going to be mired in politics. But it is already mired in politics, would be my reading. And politics is about power and interest, and there's plenty of power and interest already embedded in how ICANN is set up now. And any kind of system that comes out, any kind of model that comes out tomorrow or in the next 18 months will also be mired in power and interest. And it's maybe better to acknowledge that and talk about that than try and keep governments, in a box, because I don't think that will ever happen.
Just a very quick comment, if I may, or did you? Yeah. No. I think you're absolutely spot on. I think we're in a world of pioneering a new form of governance, which looks a lot like some of the governance we had 3,000 years ago, maybe in some places, more of a sort of tribal sitting around sort of thing. And because we're pioneering this, of course, we make mistakes. And we are young organizations. The internet is young. And now it reaches 3 billion people. A lot of the issues we are dealing with now are both problematic, or difficult, both because it's not just about governments sitting around a table, and it can't for a number of reasons, mainly around competencies and responsibilities, but it's also global. This is the first time that truly we have something, we're dealing with intangibles that can be global straight away. And this is novel. So we're in this truly post-Westphalian mode where it's not just about the nation state anymore. It's about the nation state and, that's the point, and about this globality that we have to deal with and sort of balancing the local and the global. So it's fascinating, and what I try to always say to people is, you know, it's not because it's so complex that we shouldn't work constructively about improving it, rather than just dissing it because, hey, this just feels uncomfortable and new.
I'm conscious because this is the summer messaging session, or the SMS. We need to start coming up with some 140 character messages, but actually we seem to be the only people tweeting about the UK IGF anyway, so we're already doing that. So, well, exactly, even shortened. A word from the boss.
Rennie Fritchie Nominate. This is a personal view, and it's alongside the Monty Python perspective here. There's a television program in this country called Grand Designs, and that follows people who take an old building and want to transform it whilst keeping the integrity of the building into something that's new and different, but is connected to what was there before. And I've watched this program, and I've watched the mistakes that are made over and over again. And what goes wrong is that everybody thinks this is the time to make every change on everything because there's an opportunity. And so people, having got planning permission, having got agreement, having got building inspectors, having got the architects, having got the people who are going to own it and live in it, decide what it's about, then people pile in at different times with extra twiddly bits to add in with no idea of the implications or the costs or what the technology can and can't do, and it spirals way out of proportion. It goes way over time, and it never hits budget, time, or anything else. And people fall out, fire their architects, get divorced, and a whole range of things. So for me, there's some lessons in here about the kind of golden thread of purpose, what you're there for and what you're trying to do, principles, what is it that underpins you, and proportionality, what is it reasonable to do at different times, and to hold on to that in order to deliver a practical outcome, because all the time the people are living in the house. So we come back to, we have to continuously deliver what's being delivered. So I'm going grand design rather than Monty Python, but I do think there's some really good lessons about holding on to something important, recognizing what's central, recognizing what's timely, recognizing what's adjacent, recognizing what's for later, and recognizing actually what's not going to be on the agenda for the foreseeable future. And that's the kind of discussions I think that we need to take forward. But as I say, this is a personal view, not a nominate view.
There's an important point there, which is about whether or not the changes that people think need making to ICANN are simply being projected onto the IANA function. And this was Alejandro's point, I think, in the opening session about be careful what you wish for. About, you know, you might achieve a successful transition of IANA, but it's not satisfactory to the critics because their criticism was never about the IANA function really in the first place. It was about the ICANN function. So, Alex, you wanted to mention something about that?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I completely agree with that. I think it's a very important perspective on this, that we cannot end up in a situation where we put in jeopardy the continued functioning of the excellent management and the functioning of the internet. Can't be sacrificed. I wanted to just come back on this point about political recognition of political interests and influences and a governance model that actually places that in the has that in mind. As you helpfully reminded everyone, I did many years ago. I used to be a civil servant, so I have some sort of sympathy with both sides of the argument here, really. But it seems to me that what's interesting is that there's a very, very high level of agreement now with the approach, a very high level of agreement amongst governments with the multi-stakeholder approach. And that is for the pragmatic reasons that I think Sarah Taylor was alluding to earlier. So it's not so much a point of principle as a recognition of the fact that in such a complex environment, the network of networks as it was described, actually seeking to impose policy and standards top down is never going to work. It's a model that's doomed to fail. Where I think there is an interesting question is, how does the broader public interest manifest itself and get played into the debate within ICANN? So there's no doubt that the conduct of these technical functions and the development of policies that go with these technical functions will carry with it issues around privacy, for instance, issues around intellectual property protection. How does that public interest actually manifest itself? And how does the Government Advisory Committee, as the point body in the current structure, itself come to a view of where the balance of the public interest lies? Now, I just want to make one comment on that, which is it's been remarkable over the last couple of years to see the way that, in my view, the debate, for instance, where at one poll you might have privacy and at the other poll you might have strong rules on intellectual property protection, has been skewed almost entirely in the direction of stronger and stronger rules on intellectual property, to the point where it was necessary for the data protection regulators to intervene in a very direct way to say, hang on, there's an aspect of the public interest here which is completely missing in ICANN's deliberations on the subject of new GTLD protections. So actually, having said we don't want to get too mired in detail, one important piece of detail that I think does need to be looked at is the GAC functioning in the way that it should. Now, the French have put on the table the proposal that we move to a General Assembly type model. I don't think that's the answer. I think the answer is, how do we make sure that governments are themselves coordinating inputs into the GAC in a way that means that the GAC actually is a genuinely representative, balanced guide and input to the overall policy-making process? Because at the moment, I don't believe that it is fulfilling that role very well at all.
I'd like to piggyback on that, but from a wider perspective, not just focusing on GAC, which is about the capabilities or the capacity and the diversity of the various stakeholder groups. I think there are some GAC representatives who are doing a formidable job, and there are many who are new, many who could do a bit of help. And I know they discussed that in the GAC meeting last week, how to empower the GAC members, and you know, just simple things such as having newcomer sessions for new government representatives at ICANN. And then, you know, some of them might need to do a bit of work back home on, you know, how you do policy making, how you consult stakeholders. I mean, we're lucky in the UK. We've got, well, I don't know if it's still got budget, but we used to have something called the National Civil Service College, which did some great courses about policy making and all sorts of other stuff to be a good civil servant and do your job properly. I'm not targeting a particular government here, but, you know, I'm sure some of them would benefit from those courses. And if we look at other stakeholder groups, I think that generally there's both a need for education and capacity building. So these people, when they come to ICANN, really know how it works and how they can generally participate. But before that, if you will, it's my job, it's the outreach part. It's us as ICANN going out there, and the community, of course, in ICANN, going out there, engaging with stakeholder groups who are not yet involved or not sufficiently involved. You know, the IP community has organized very, very well within ICANN. They weren't so much there 6-7 years ago. By now, they've got an established group. They feed in very well into other groups. That's just one example. That's not to say that if we don't engage properly with them, civil society shouldn't have the same sort of influence, and we should get more civil society groups. Actually, we had a really good meeting about 10 days ago, just before the start of the London meeting, with lots of new NGOs, people like Amnesty International turned out, Privacy International, and the idea is to try and make them understand what is happening at ICANN, why it matters to them, or how it matters to them, and how they can participate effectively. And we need to do that for all sorts of communities, like the wider business community and elsewhere. And it's not just because it sounds nice. It's because we're going to get better decision-making, simply. We have an internet that's global, and an internet that's diverse in terms of usage, and we need the governance mechanisms to reflect that. The more we do that, in a way, the more the governance mechanisms themselves won't matter so much, because we'll have much more of a genuine representation. So that, to me, it's my day-to-day job, and I think it's one of the most important objectives. If we crack the diversity of the representation in the governance mechanisms, then we solve a whole host of problems.
Just a quick question. Civil society representation on the CC is not just going to be Berkman Centre, which is not civil society, is it?
I think the Berkman Center would come in as an expert rather than a representative of the civil society.
Do you have the diagram of the, okay. Because it's helpful to have a look at.
We're sort of into last words, and yes, of course, we have 160 characters, but if people want to tweet 140, I'm sure we can use that going forwards. I didn't want to end with some kind of wrap-up where we try to say this is what the UK IGF's perspective is on things, because in actual fact, I feel as if I've not taken any learnings from this session. I have taken lessons, which I believe is the correct word to use about these things. And I think that's really very useful. I don't know, will there be a transcript, by the way, available of the session? There'll be a recording, I think, yes. I want to use this. I'll pretend it's my students, but it's for me, really, to review afterwards. Any last thoughts, Dominique, Alex?
I mean, from my point of view, I think this has been a useful conversation. I think people, if there's one thing I'd like people to be taking away from this, it's that this stuff really matters. A lot of the problem of engagement on internet governance is that it often feels like a highly abstract and somewhat theoretical debate. Actually, now we're into some real concrete choices and decisions, which, if we get them wrong, actually could have a profound effect on the way the internet functions. So I think this stuff is important, and if we in the UK can continue to play a leading role in influencing and shaping this debate, then I think that would be a great place for us to be.
I think this has been really interesting, and I think the one thing I would take away, well, two things really, I guess I would take away from this is, first, that there needs to be greater awareness, and second, there needs to be greater participation, which means I think we all have, private sector, civil society, whatever, have a role to play to kind of talk about this. And I know we talked at the IGF, but I mean in other areas and conferences and other places that we go to.
I just want to finish with a couple of sort of personal thoughts about engagement. Many of you are aware that I'm involved in a European consortium called the European Internet Science Project, which is a group of 38 universities looking at how these things work. We have an engagement already. Ian Brown is in another room talking about cybersecurity as we speak. Ian heads the privacy working group, and I know that we have an interest in the privacy elements of the WHOIS transition, which I think is very interesting for me, specifically from a privacy perspective, but also from a process perspective. And we want to be engaged, particularly, I think, with Jean-Jacques' work on new participants in governance, because I think that will be one of the critical issues going forward over the next year. So I should say that personally I found this extremely useful. I want to thank everyone for contributing, particularly because I called on them from the audience, Alejandro and Desiree and Malcolm, and also our panelists, Dominique, Alex and Jean-Jacques. And thank you to everybody.